All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our book share with Livia Blackburne and Julia Kuo. This is just a really special program for us. Not only will we get a special reading of I Dream of Popo, their new picture book, but Livia and Julia will discuss their inspiration for the book and their creative process and answer questions from participants. It's wonderful to have you join us. My name is Courtney Waring. I'm the Director of Education at the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art. And before we begin, I'd just like to thank the Carle, our members and donors, the Patricia Morrison McDonald Endowment Fund for supporting the Carle's education programs, and also the Massachusetts Cultural Council for their operational support. I'd also like to thank our co-hosts tonight, the Five College Center for East Asian Studies. There are neighbors here in the Western Mass Five College area, and it's wonderful to be able to partner with them on this special program. So, Livia and Julia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
To provide all of us with quick introductions, Livia is the New York Times bestselling author. Livia was born in Taipei, Taiwan, and moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico when she was 5. She wrote her first novel while researching the neuroscience of reading at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And after a 12-year stint at Harvard and MIT, where she earned an AB in biochemical sciences and a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, she moved to Los Angeles and switched to full-time writing. She is the author of The Midnight Thief and Rosemark. And Julia Kuo is a Taiwanese-American illustrator currently based in Cleveland, Ohio. She's worked with the New York Times, Google, and Science Friday. She is the illustrator of Drawing Leaves and Trees, Observing and Sketching the Natural World, Katrina Goldsato's The Sound of Silence, and Ronnie Schotter's Go Little Green Truck. And tonight, we're just so glad that Livia and Julia are presenting their new collaboration together, the beautiful picture book, I Dream of Popo, which received the starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus. So Livia, why don't you get us started? We're going to share screen so all of us can read your beautiful book.
Alrighty. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Guess we'll just start off with reading the book and then go from there. I Dream of Popo. Okay. I dream with Popo as she rocks me in her arms. She sings Bebe Xing, Bebe Gan. In my heart I hear, my baby, my heart, my baby, my love. I walk with Popo in the park, squeezing her finger in my chubby palm. When I wobble, she holds me up. She pushes me on the swing and lifts me to hear the birds sing. I bow to Popo on New Year's Day. She asks if I've been good and gives me a red envelope. Then she fries up crispy, gooey, sweet New Year's cakes, so hot they almost burn my tongue. I sit with Popo and she shows me where I'm going to live. Here is Taiwan, so tiny, surrounded by blue. There is San Diego, far, far away. You will learn and see many new things, she says. I wave at Popo before I board my flight with Mama and Baba. The airplane thrums like the biggest cat I've ever seen. Fly safely, Popo says. Call me every week and tell me about your adventures. I think of Popo as I meet new friends, kids with hair of every color and skin of every shade. They say hi. I say ni hao. I talk to Popo from across the sea. I'm learning a new language, I say, and I miss your dumplings. I'll make them for you when you visit, she says. I draw Popo at my new school. Below the picture, I write my grandma, though it feels strange to call her that. I learn other words too. Dumplings, my grandma, motorcycle, San Diego. After a while, the words form easier on my tongue. I hug Popo when I come back to visit. Now ni hao is what feels strange in my mouth. Other words too are hard to catch, like fish in a deep well. I asked Mama why I can't talk to Popo like before. You can still hug her as tight as before, she says. I do. Popo hugs me even tighter. I eat with Popo in her house, surrounded by the fragrance of guihua blossoms. She cooks my favorite dumplings dipped in soy sauce and sesame oil. Her house looks smaller than I remember, but everything smells the same. Popo looks smaller too. Her hair is more white. When I board the plane again, Popo packs me dumplings to eat on the way. I wonder how she'll look when I see her again. I pray for Popo when we hear she is sick. I sing to her as she lies in bed, frail under heavy blankets. I wish I could reach across the ocean and hold her up. She whispers to me in a voice soft as birdsong, Bebe Xing, my baby, my heart. It's a promise and a kiss. I dream of Popo coming to me while I sleep. I say, Ni hao. She says, hello. I say, Wa ai ni. She says, I love you too. A breeze brushes my face, rich with the scent of guihua. I tell Popo about my adventures, and she smiles.
It's so beautiful, Livia. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I want to share with all of our guests joining us tonight, feel free to, tell us who you are, go into the chat, let us know who you are, where you're coming from. And we also have the Q&A button. So as Livia and Julia are talking to us about the book and about their creative process, if you have any questions, we will be taking a look at that, both the chat and the Q&A. And we'll also be adding some information in the chat, some links that you might be interested in checking out later after this program. And Julia, you've got some wonderful images to share with us as well, talking a little bit more about your process in illustrating I Dream of Popo. I can't wait to see it.
So Courtney, are we starting with the questions for each other?
I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own creative process and coming up with the illustrations for I Dream of Popo.
Yeah, so, a lot of children's books require me to do a lot of research for, the last book I made was I Dream of, or The Sound of Silence by Katrina Goldsato, and that was set in Tokyo and is a little bit about a little boy. And so I had to do a lot of research, figure out, what that environment looked like. I spent a lot of time on Google Street View, like kind of walking around. But for I Dream of Popo, the really beautiful thing about it is that it was based off of my own experiences. I moved back to Taiwan when I was 4 and I left at the age of 5. So I actually left at the same age as Livia and have all these memories of, being with my grandparents. And so a lot of those memories are in this book. For example, the dining table in the newer scene is what my grandma's dining table looks like every night. But my parents actually moved back to Taiwan when I was an adult, and I've been going back every year for the past 10 years. And so I have all these adult experiences too, of being able to wander around and get to know Taiwan in a different way. And so those experiences definitely made it into the book too.
And I love, Livia, you talk about, that this is, Julie, you mentioned that you're bringing your own personal experiences and stories into the book. And Livia, you did the same as well, correct?
Right, yeah. So, no, I myself, I was born in Taiwan as well. And growing up in Taiwan, I spent a lot of time with my Popo. She took care of me a lot. And so we were very close, but then I moved to the United States and obviously things were different then. We called each other, long distance phone calls, no FaceTime back then. And every year I would visit, but obviously the relationship was dynamic, had changed. And I also started losing my Chinese, which made it harder, I think, to communicate with her. So, my grandmother passed away when I was a teenager, and every once in a while I will have dreams about her, and the dreams will be about different things, but always there'll be one thread in that we'll be having really in-depth conversations in English, which is something we were never able to do in real life. So that was actually the spark for the story, and the idea of a girl dreaming about her popo speaking to her in English. And like Julia, I also just dug into all my memories of the foods of New Year and all of that to kind of try to bring the story to life.
Well, and that's one of the questions I have for both of you. There's so much wonderful attention to detail in this book. You know, how text and image really get readers to imagine the sights and the sounds and the smells of a place and home. You're really providing us with these just wonderful memories. What steps did you take to kind of get that level of detail and accuracy in the book?
Well, the food was the easiest because you know those memories are very vivid. You know, the New Year's cake, especially with Lunar New Year coming up in Yangao, just like crispy and gooey. Yeah, for me, it was just kind of digging into my memories and just trying to find the right words to describe them. I don't know about you, Julia.
I think pretty similar to what I was describing, pulling from my own experiences and the way it felt, the things that stood out to me. I think that in wanting readers to feel transported back to Taiwan, for those of them who are familiar with the environment, there were certain things that I felt like needed to be in a book about Taiwan. Like you had to have a motorcycle, you had to have a crowded alleyway, the food is necessary. Even the color palette, like the red is a super auspicious color and you'll see it everywhere. But even the greens, Taiwan is a subtropical island and there's plants like growing absolutely everywhere year round. It's so lush. So, I think I did stop and think in the very beginning, like, what are some images that I need to get in here that represent Taiwan and that would make people identify with it? And then from there, I kind of filled out the rest of the story, like in terms of the plot.
And I love, I'm looking in the chat and thank you, Rachel. Rachel's coming to us from New York and she says so many elements that are resonating in the story. It's just so beautiful. And we're all, having this kind of connection to it. We're all experiencing and relating to being separated from loved ones because of COVID, because of social distancing. What kind of response have you heard from readers?
I think from the Taiwanese readers, just the feeling of representation. I think that this is probably one of the first, I don't want to say the first, but one of the first Taiwanese American books that I know of for children out here in the US market. And I think for people to be able to see themselves represented, like an environment that is familiar to them, even their Black hair and like the girl's little bowl cut, it's just, it makes a difference. And I think we've just been hearing like, oh, we're glad to be able to read this to my child and to be like, oh, that reminds me of my popo. Or remember when we went back to Taiwan and did this?
Yeah, like same for me. Yeah, it has been really touching to hear just the reactions, especially from Asian Americans, Taiwanese Americans. People saying like, "Oh, so this is what it's like to read a children's book that has my experience in it." I've never had that experience before. Yeah, and that's just really been really humbling to be a part of. And then so there's that aspect, and then the whole like pandemic aspect. We wrote this and illustrated it before the pandemic hit, and we were thinking about immigrants when we have these spreads of people FaceTiming their family, but obviously now everybody's FaceTiming their the grandparents, their relatives, and so a lot of people have said, oh, this is very relevant now.
Yeah, I just want to add, it's been really nice to see friends who aren't Taiwanese reading the book with their popo or their grandmother, or even talking about how this book made them, miss their grandma who is one town away, but they just can't see them right now.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you, Emily, for sharing in the chat, sharing that she was born in Taiwan, and talking about that connection, her sons with their popo, and how reading your book has made her very sentimental because of her boys experiencing the Chinese culture via their Popo, and it's through the food and through her food as well. This is, I think just such a book that I know David, my colleague, who's been providing some wonderful content in the chat. This is just such a sweet, kind, loving book that is really timeless. I mean, this is a book that, yes, we're in a pandemic right now, we can all relate to it, but it is that connection. It's that connection with people that it really celebrates, and that connection with family. And, I think another thing that you had mentioned, I think on your website, Livia, that another special component of this is the working with Julia and Connie. What was that like, having that kind of incredible triad in support of this book?
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, going into it, I never thought that we would end up with a team like this. But I just feel so fortunate. Connie was the first person to buy the book, and she's Taiwanese American as well. And when she read it, she just got it right away. It was her story too. And then she immediately thought of Julia, and Julia identified with it too. And I think it just added like another layer of emotional weight to what we were doing. We were just really motivated to tell our story in as authentic a way as possible.
Yeah, and I think that there is what I really loved about working on this book is that there are some cultural truths, so for example, in the illustrations, I didn't have to explain why there is like a huge 20-pound bag of rice sitting on the floor in the kitchen scene, or why there's a big cleaver there. These are just things common in every Chinese or every Taiwanese household. But another thing that, I was thinking about is, I remember when the design of the book was coming back for review, and I was looking at, oh no, I can't show it. I was looking at some of the words choices and what color they were in. And so on the title page, the Popo and I Dream of Popo is kind of this orangey color. And on the next page, I Dream with Popo, it's highlighted in orange. And I was like, oh, it should be red to fit with the color scheme. But Connie was like, growing up, I had always heard that names shouldn't be written in red. And I was like, oh my goodness, you're right. Like, I've definitely heard that same thing too. It's like a kind of like a bad omen. And so like, that was it. That was the end of the conversation. We both recognized that this is true and this is not the right thing for this particular book. And I just really loved sharing those, that similar base of knowledge with the rest of them.
That's wonderful, Julia. Thank you. And I think that you might have some images to share with us, kind of talking a little bit more about your inspiration, where you got it from as you were creating the illustrations. This is a part I know a lot of us at the Carle love to hear from both authors and artists, how they get their inspiration, what their process looks like. So can't wait to see what you're going to share with us.
Yeah. Should we start sharing that, Livia? I can start
Sure,
with,
yeah.
I can start with talking about the styles that we chose for I Dream of Popo. So, every book looks different no matter how many books you've worked on. Some illustrators stay more in one style than others. And for myself, I definitely move around. Every book looks totally different. And so when we were starting with I Dream of Popo, the first thing that Connie and I did was sit down and talk about what the style should be. And so I kind of pitched two different styles. One was based on shapes and had this kind of like muted, warm feeling. And the other one was based on line work. This was a lot more similar to my last book, The Sound of Silence. And Connie ended up going with the shapes one. And I think that it made a lot of sense because I Dream of Popo, it makes you feel nostalgic, and it's like this very warm, emotional book, and it fit the feeling of the manuscript a lot better. And so once we settled on that particular style, I built out a couple of sample images for the book. These don't usually have to be an exact spread from the book, but these are pretty close to what you end up seeing. And this is just to make sure that we're all on the same visual language. So, I'd love to ask Livia questions too.
Sure.
So, I know we kind of already talked about your inspiration for the book and how you used to dream about your Popo. But I also know that this is your first children's book. And you're famous for writing these, YA or like fantasy novels. So what was it like switching to a children's book?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I never thought I would be writing picture books, but then I had a daughter, and the daughter loved picture books. And so, suddenly I'm reading, like I think hundreds of books a year. And I just fell in love with them. I hadn't read them since I was young. And, I just started to really appreciate them just as an art form. And so, this idea popped into my head. I was lucky enough to have a friend who kind of walked me through the Henry Hertz, who walked me through the basics of how to write a picture book. And this one, it actually came through very easily because it had such a distinct structure to it. So I knew, I started with I Dream of Popo at the very end, and then I knew I wanted it to tell the story. So a picture book is 32 pages. So I thought of it in terms of roughly 14 spreads, 28 pages, 14 spreads of 2 pages. And I just had a line for each, and I started, there was I didn't do it in order. I just kind of filled in the important life events and then filled in the gaps in between until I had 28. And, so, writing a novel versus making a picture book, it's like building a ship versus making a ship in a bottle. So, novels, you're kind of like making these rough like cuts on like big pieces of wood and like shifting stuff around and like running around. Versus a picture book where you're really just like taking your tweezers and fixing, this one sentence or a phrase or something else. You get to be really careful about every single detail, which I really liked. I mean, and the best part of it is that you write a draft in the afternoon and then you give it to the illustrator, and the illustrator does all the work, the rest of the work. So that's about it.
I mean, what I like about your analogy is that it's not, you're still building a whole ship. It's not like you're building like a paper boat versus a ship. That it still like takes a lot of craft and work.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and yeah, it definitely it's a different type of effort, but it's definitely still work. Let's see. Did I have any questions? Do you want to talk about how your time in Taiwan influenced I Dream of Popo?
Yeah. You know what? So I did like kind of talk a little bit about like, oh, me being in Taiwan, like I relied on my experiences and everything I saw. But another thing that I did in Taiwan is like, I always take lots of pictures. And I think that I happened to be in Taiwan at this stage when I was working on I Dream of Popo. And so just like all the things that I saw around me at the Riverside Park or like down the street from me, like this woman sweeping, I just took lots and lots of reference photos. Because there's nothing better than having your own reference photos versus looking on Google Images for them. And so some of these actually made it into the book. So the image on the right is my mom and she's holding my niece. And this was during one of my visits back. And this actually became that last spread in the book with Popo and her granddaughter in the Guihua. So here's a photo. There's kind of like the sample sketch that came out of it and then the final image with the Guihua. And so this, I think that there are a couple spreads in the book where they definitely came straight out of photos that I had taken when I was in Taiwan. Okay, so, like speaking of like this process, I know that it's worlds apart from you. So what about you as a writer? What was creating an actual manuscript like?
You mean the manuscript itself was easy. Well, I mean, each draft, it takes a few hours, and then there's a lot of thinking in between. But one interesting thing about this manuscript was that I think, I always like when I talk about this book, I'm like, oh, it came out so easily. I don't want to give the impression that all my books do, because this is definitely like the one that came out most fully formed, and maybe because it was so personal and it was just like in there like waiting to come out. So I think I wrote a draft and then gave it to my critique group and made changes. One interesting thing is that where is he? Sorry, I'm a visitor.
This is your, your official book reader.
Right,
Who wants
right.
to make sure this event is going well.
And pandemic life. That's my daughter. All right, where was I? Oh, right. So I sent it off to Connie. So one interesting story about this manuscript itself is that in the original manuscript, it was much more clear that Popo passes away. There's actually a line in there that I cry for Popo as we lay her to rest. And that was, we went back and forth about that a lot because, it's hard to sell a picture book about death. It's a tough subject. You don't want to spring it on parents. We talked about, do we want to change it? But it was really important to me to have that because one of the points of the book was that they had a connection in death that they didn't have in life. That was a big core of the story for me. So, we took it on submission and, I just kind of thought, if we can sell it, we'll sell it. But, I'm going to, this is the core of the story for me. I'm not going to change it. And then so we hear from Connie and she tells Jim, she loves the story. She wants to talk to me about this one thing, just a minor change, can we talk on the phone? And, I'm thinking, if she's thinking it's a minor change, maybe it's not going to be about, she's not going to make me take out the death. So, I'm on the phone with her. We're both like really excited. It's like the first date, and, she hasn't bought the book yet. And she goes, yeah, so I just wanted to talk to you about the book. I had this one suggestion, just a small thing. It's about it's about Popo dying at the end. I go, oh no. But actually, she had a really good idea, which was, you're not changing the end of the story. You just take out those lines so that it's more ambiguous. It's just slightly more ambiguous. So the adults reading it, they'll get what happened, but the kids, they might not understand it. And, if they're not ready to have that conversation yet, then, they'll just, for my daughter still, it's still just the story about this girl who spends time with her Popo. And, developmentally at this time, I think it's good for her that way. So I'm really happy. I'm really grateful that Connie kind of had that idea. Let me see. So Julia, do you want to talk a little bit about the process of making these images? Did you sketch them out first, or?
Yeah, and I realized Courtney, you're trying to ask me this in the beginning. So,
well, that's okay. And Kristen, who's also just added to the Q&A, is asking about the illustrations. She says, regarding illustrations, could you talk about your thought process on individual compositions and your overall visual plan for the book, which is such a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kristen.
No, absolutely. So I think as far as overall plan, I think those things about like what I wanted to get into these environments and like how to round it out though, how to balance all the visual information I wanted to put into the environment with moving along the plot and the narrative are the two things I'm balancing. But let me show you a little bit of what I do. So in the beginning, after we've established the style and we've had those sample images, then I dive into the sketches and I make these really rough sketches. And you can see that, sometimes I just use blobs for colors to indicate that they're surrounded by greenery. For this walking in the park scene, I had this sample of them walking here, but I also thought, should they be in a park where you can also see the dense urban environment behind them? Or should we break up the spread into two different pages so that we can get kind of another intimate close-up of Popo and the little girl interacting? And these are all really rough sketches. So you can see that like the trees are drawn so crudely that I actually added an image of ficus trees to be like, ficus trees actually do look like this. This isn't just my terrible like chicken scratch drawing. And I think the same process went throughout the entire book. So for example, you wouldn't recognize these last couple of images here because this is when I was still working out how to portray this very tender and delicate ending. I wanted to show sadness, but connection at the same time, like sadness and longing. And for example, for the spread where Popo comes to her as she sleeps, you know, in this sketch, they're much closer and they're on this dark green background, which works with the color palette. But we decided that it was a little bit too somber, you know, and so we changed the background to red. And then we also wanted it to be a little bit more dreamlike. So that's why we zoomed way out and kind of put them on that cloud pattern, to make it more apparent that this is happening in a dream state rather than like Popo coming to her in her bed. And so I have like little notes here. And so this process goes on and on for a couple rounds until we feel like we're satisfied. So I think it took us 3 rounds of sketches to feel like we were in a good enough place to take that to finish. But you know, even in the finishes, there are a lot of adjustments that were made. So here are just 4 spreads that kind of shifted during the process. For example, in the top where they're talking to each other, you can see that I actually started with giving them phones, like they're talking to each other on what would now be very old-fashioned phones. And I think this reflects this feeling that a lot of illustrators have where we don't really want to depict modern technology because we think it's fleeting and it'll date our book, or we personally don't like it. But you know, this is another conversation I had with Connie, the editor, where we're like, you know what, the reality is that this is FaceTime and video chat is how kids interact with their grandparents these days. So many of them see that little square in the corner and they're like, this is where Popo lives in my phone or my iPad. And so you can see that the spreads gradually become more and more recognizable as a video chat. Some of the decisions are more aesthetic. So on this page where she's drawing, like it pretty much stays the same, but then I add in this pink background so you can see the outline of the pages, and that's simply for visual interest. Another thing we did was we had the little girl appearance change when she moves to the States. So in Taiwan, she always has this red dress and she has that bowl cut, but when she gets to the States, she grows out her bowl cut, probably like most Taiwanese American kids would want to do. And then she changes, you know, a dress just to indicate like she has changed, you know, she loses her language too. And I think that that should be reflected in how she looks. And lastly, this kitchen scene, you can see that things get flip-flopped. Part of the process is figuring out how things will print. So between 2 pages is the gutter. And so illustrators always have to be mindful of things getting swallowed up into the gutter. So the little girl gets moved away from the gutter, then we decide that it's even better if they're spaced apart. And then we kind of bring in some background elements to add more depth to it. Yeah, so those are just, you know, some of the many ways that we kind of tried to make the book more interesting and appealing to readers. And I could go on about like all the little things that were changed here, but I won't.
Well, and I just want to add, you know, I love, Julie, as you're talking about the gutter, David and I, you know, we love looking at picture books and talking about those different book design elements that illustrators are using to help tell the story visually. And I definitely noticed how you employ the gutter in many different ways. And I think Nina in the chat just spoke about the back matter. You know, right before we started, I was telling Livia and Julia, I love the case cover. I love the end papers. I love the back matter. The back matter, in addition to that incredible glossary, you have, you're really, you know, telling us your own personal story, you know, in a lot of wonderful, poignant detail. What was it like writing that and sharing that part of you to add to this book and to share with our readers?
Well, we have Connie to thank for the back matter a lot. It was her idea to put it in. She wanted author notes, just explaining several things, you know, our own personal stories, and then also explaining some of the cultural aspects, the language, the details in the book that the readers might not quite understand. And she also was really emphasized kind of the idea of like memory and thinking back and the details that, you know, geographic details that kind of get mixed with our memories of people and our memories of important times in our lives. And so she kind of guided, at least me, kind of in writing all of those things. As far as writing it itself, I think it was just a matter of just really going back and just digging into my own memories, which was fun because I hadn't thought about the taste of rice noodles in a really long time, or that one night I came from Taiwan to Albuquerque and it was 27 degrees Fahrenheit when we got off the plane. I had just come from a tropical island. So it was really fun to relive those memories and share them.
Yeah, I think, not every editor will let you write, a whole entire essay's worth in the back of a children's book about your own experience. So this was really special indeed. I think what I found so meaningful about it was being able to kind of like, it felt like I was having a conversation with readers where I was like, well, this is how I connect to Livia's story. So this is not exactly what I experienced, but in a way it's a mashup of my experiences and my parents' experiences, right? So my parents moved away from Taiwan and had to say goodbye to their family. But then I also left and had to say goodbye to my grandparents. And now that my parents live in Taiwan, I have this type of relationship with them now. Like I visit them every year in Taiwan. I see how Taiwan changes every year when I come back. I have trouble speaking Mandarin when I come back. And so I think I just feel really grateful that we are given the space to share these own personal details.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Livia and Julia. For our participants, we're wrapping up. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes left. If you'd like to add any question to the chat or Q&A. I know we've asked Julia and Livia if they have any questions that they'd like to share of each other. We love being a fly on the wall when authors and artists chat with each other. And I just seen a question Rachel has, Livia and Julia, really love your earlier call out about the importance of representation, especially giving adults and children alike an opportunity to see someone that looks like them in media publications. In an effort to diversify the content we consume, are there any other books that you'd recommend with AAPI representation or otherwise?
Great question. I just read, let's see, The Most Beautiful Thing by, I forget the author. That came out earlier last year, and it's this beautiful story. Also about, it's about a Hmong girl and her grandmother and their relationship. I'd recommend it. Let's see, Eyes That Kiss at the Corners also came out recently. It's kind of a celebration of Asian beauty. And most notably Asian eyes, because there's so much baggage and sometimes negative stereotypes around it. Let's see, there is Watercress coming out soon, which I actually haven't read, but I'm really excited about. It touches on a girl who is she and her family, they see watercress by the side of the road, and they get out to pick it, and at first she's not happy about it, but then she learns about her mom shares their family experience with the famine in China, and that kind of changes her view of that. Julia, do you have any?
Yeah, I just want to say there's another book that came out recently. It's called 10 Little Dumplings. It's by Larissa Fan and Cindy. I don't know if it's Wume, but it's about, it's kind of like told in a fable style where it's about 10 brothers and like all the things they do, like, as like one homogenous group. But then like you notice in all the spreads that there is a sister who's lurking and kind of doing her own individual thing. And I just love the idea of that too. And the illustrator is Taiwanese.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Great question. As we're wrapping up, are there any other questions, Livia and Julie, that we missed that you'd like to ask of each other? I know, Julie, you had mentioned I think you've got an image of your end papers. Were you going to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind those?
Yeah,
yeah.
Cool.
Love those.
So, one thing that I enjoyed sneaking into the book was kind of this little shift. So in the scene where the little girl is realizing that her pupil is very sick and they're kind of like having one of their last chats via video chat, you can see that they're kind of mirroring each other in their scene. They're both doing something similar and kind of set up in the same way. And so that kind of gives the opportunity for contrast, right? And so I had the two different bedspreads, both having cloud patterns on them, but done in different ways. So one is done in a Western cloud pattern style, and the other one is done in a more Eastern format, kind of what you would see on like a scroll or something like that. And so that cloud pattern becomes the background for the next spread where they're meeting in their dreams. And so we ended up using that for the end papers too, because I thought that it would just be a really nice way to tie together kind of like this, kind of like the mental state for the little girl. She may have moved away to the US, but there will always be a part of her that lives in Taiwan and is thinking of her pulpul.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. And Charlene is asking, any words of advice or inspiration for aspiring authors and illustrators of color?
Well, in general, so there's like the general advice, which I always tell people, writing, you don't need a fancy degree or anything. There's jobs where you need like, a doctor, you need an MD, but writing, you just need the experience. You learn by doing. So write. Find people who you trust, who enjoy the same types of stories that you write, and get their feedback. I know my critique group was so important in my early years as a writer, and I actually still meet with the same critique group now. It's been 10 years, 10, 11 years. Yeah, as far as like Asian American writers of color, I had a really interesting journey. My debut was a very traditional medieval fantasy. You couldn't, the main character in my head kind of looked like me, but you wouldn't really be able to tell just from the writing. And then, I gradually moved more and more. Rosemark had kind of more Asian seeming characters. And then I Dream of Popo is like, very Chinese. And I don't know if I have any particular, advice around that. I think just, I don't want to recommend that Asian writers, write in any particular, category or style. I mean, just, kind of feel yourself out, write, try different things. Eventually you'll find your voice and find what, is true to you.
Yeah, as for illustrators, I'll also kind of break it up into a similar two-part, just becoming an illustrator period, and then illustrators of color. I think for illustrators period, it does depend where you are in the process. It can be a very complicated and confusing one. There's no set path out there for illustration, and it often appears to be a black box to many. And so I think it's great to talk to people. I would be happy to talk. I'll put my email in the chat. But one general word of advice I can give is just be as prolific as you can. Make a lot of things and make the things that you would want to be hired for. So create your dream projects and then put them out there for the world to see, because there's no way that people are going to know what you're capable of or even what you're interested in doing unless there's an example out there. And so I miss kind of my downtime, because that's what I do with my downtime now in between projects, is I work on the projects that I want to be hired for, and I'll like create my personal work that way. As for illustrators of color, I think that it's wonderful to be able to tell these stories that are particular to this Taiwanese environment, and but I always think back to Snowy Day, and that was such a landmark book because this little boy who's playing in the snow doesn't need, like, he doesn't need to explain why he's Black. He's not Black in the story for any other reason other than that he's Black. It doesn't contribute to the plot. And that is simply who he is. And he is being portrayed like living a wonderful day, playing in the snow. And I think that's kind of my personal goal as far as how I want representation to look in children's literature and in my other illustrations. I simply want us to be represented doing the whole entire diverse range of things that we do, from things that do feel culturally Asian to things that don't, including things that you might assign to someone who is white, or or someone who is part of what you would think is the majority culture. And so I would challenge you to think, like, what do I want representation to look like, and what part do I want in that? I hope that helps.
Thank you, Julia and Livia. That's wonderful. And and thank you, Avery. Avery's joining us. She's 8 years old and she loves writing and drawing. So I kind of feel like we have in our group today this emerging author illustrator that we might have join us. Avery, maybe we'll have you for a program one of these days with your first picture book. That's exciting. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you. I feel like if you've seen the comments in the chat, we are just so grateful that you've created this incredibly beautiful book and brought it out into the world. And in a time where we're all feeling a little disconnected, thank you for connecting us all tonight around this beautiful book. Before we wrap up, I think our guests would love to hear what's on the horizon for you. Anything that we should be on the lookout for?
Julia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I need to get rid of my virtual background for this.
And thank you, David. David's added in the chat. Livia and Julia have signed book plates, autograph book plates that we have at the Carle shop. So you can follow the link if you'd like a signed book of I Dream of Popo.
So now that you can see where I live. So one thing that I'm really excited about is a book I have coming out later this year, and I actually just got FNGs for it. So it's amazing to be able to hold it in my hand. And so it's called I'm an American, the story of Wong Kim Ark. And it's the story of birthright citizenship and how that came to be. So I am an American, like, as a product of birthright citizenship, but I did not know this story until I read this manuscript. And so I'm really proud to be on this book. It's written by Martha Brockenborough and Grace Lynn, both who are forces of, like, these are incredible authors in their own right. And so I'm just so excited to share this with you all. It's coming out on November 2nd, and that is Election Day.
Perfect. Thank you, Julia. Livia, how about you?
Yeah, my next book is back to another young adult novel. Actually, I think comes out the week after Julia's book, so November 9th, I think. And it's this one's with Disney. It's called Feather and Flame. It's a book about Mulan, and it's part of a series. It's the second book in the series that kind of reimagines the Disney princesses as queens of their land. So this one has Mulan becoming an empress and the troubles that she faces there. The cover just came out for it, and it is it's stunning. It's my favorite cover of all of mine so far. And I think that did David have a link to?
Yeah, we just put it in the chat for everyone. Yes, it's
yeah.
beautiful.
Okay, yeah. If you click that link, you can see the cover, which yeah, I'm still over the moon about. I guess at some point I'll actually tell you guys about the story too, but right now I'm still obsessing about the cover.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Livia and Julia, for sharing I Dream of Popo with us. And please, happy reading, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for future programs. You can check our website. David has a link that he'll share if you want to follow any upcoming events that we do virtually. In fact, we have one next week with Deneen Milner Imprint, and it's a beautiful panel program called We Dream a World. So if you're able to join us next Thursday night, we look forward to seeing you then. But thank you, Livia and Julia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.